So in part two, I've gone ahead and finished this particular macro that I was trying to build, and so the result looks like this. I can define some protocol in a CLJC file, um, and I can then use my macro in a CLJ file to make a new macro. So def extended defsc, defsc foo, that basically supports this protocol via its options thing as a static protocol. Um, so that's what the macro looks like. And then over here, this will now support special. So if you go back and look at the other protocol, it has a special method with a lambda, and that's all good in compiling. And I could probably right here. So there's the card, there's the try it button. When I press it, I see it calls the protocol method. Okay, so I wanted to walk through the last few pieces, show you the tests we ended up with. Didn't end up with very many more tests. I think, in fact, perhaps this one where we left off, or the one before it. This code is in the Fulcro Incubator project. So if you go to GitHub FulcroLogic Fulcro Incubator, you can find this source code to go and look at it in more detail and play with it. So the final bits here, and in this case I'm writing a macro that emits a macro, and that gets really hairy. So the thing to remember when you're writing macros is really all a macro is a function that's going to pick up the arguments unevaluated, let you manipulate them, and then whatever you output is what it will send to the compiler for final compilation. So that's what you're trying to do. And like this and env variable here, this is defined for the macro, and it picks up the environment that the macro was run in. And you only get that at macro time, at this macro evaluation time. You can't use ampersand env in anything you call from the macro. So you have to pass it as an argument. Because the ampersand env, even if you're calling another macro, the ampersand env will be the environment of that one. So for example, if I called and env up here, it would tell me the location in this file as opposed to the user's file. So this is the environment of the context where the macro ran. So that's a little tricky. So that's going to be a symbol. Supported protocols, you saw the usage here just a second ago. Supported protocols is just going to be symbol, true or false, a vector of those tuples. So I'm going up to emit. Now the reason I'm doing this is I'm going to emit a macro from the macro, and you just get into coding nightmares. So it's a good idea to write a function that can return the thing you want, just to keep your head on straight. So I'm calling emit, and what emit does is it returns a quoted syntax form of def macro, and then I'm being very careful to unquote the macro name to pull in the actual macro name I got. Here I'm keeping these as literal symbols, so I'm unquoting them and then requoting them. That way I don't get name spacing from backtick. And then rewrite defsc protocols is the function we wrote and tested earlier. I don't know if we actually did that in the last video, but it's just another step in the sequence. And then I can pass the rest of the things through. And here again, I unquote and quote forms, because that's a thing I want to literally be the symbol that was used in this macro. So that's kind of the combination of piecing it together. And then I need to document to the user that, hey, you've got to put these things in appropriate kinds of files. Like the protocol needs to be visible to the macros. The macros run in Clojure, therefore the protocol needs to be in a CLJC file. And then this macro, because it's a macro, has to be run in a CLJ file or a CLJC file with a CLJ like conditional. So yeah, it's a little bit of fun when you're working with CLJS and CLJ and macros. Now, I did run into an issue here, and it took me quite a while, a lot longer than I would have liked, to find the problem. I was using an older version of the compiler, and I currently have, I'm currently compiling with a patched version of Fulcro primitives to just help me debug. So the issue that I was seeing from the compiler, let me go and break the thing. That was how it was broken. And then when I tried to use the macro, I was getting I think I have to go and cause it to reevaluate that. I think I'm being a victim of caching here. I'm going to have to restart that probably to get the error. Just to show you how ugly this can be, and a little bit about how you go about debugging macros when they go south. So this was compiling, and then when it would get to the actual piece of interest, I would get an exception. And this exception was this big, long, ugly thing, and it said, as you know, one of our lovely closure errors, I don't know how to create an async from a keyword. What the heck, right? These are kind of your nightmare scenarios, and it's the reason why I have so many like error checks in those things that I was showing you earlier, the little helper functions, like throw an exception with a meaningful error, because if an end user gets this kind of exception, they have no idea what to do. And in fact, even somebody who's been doing closure for years and writing macros, fairly advanced macros, this means nothing to me. Now, the reason it took me so long to deal with it is that was all of the exception I got from the older version of the compiler, just those lines. And so I was like, okay, group by is breaking, but I don't know who's calling group by. So now it's just like a bug hunt, a really hard bug hunt. So fortunately, after about an hour and a half of searching and commenting things and uncommenting things and rewriting things, I thought to upgrade the compiler, and it gave me a longer error message which told me this line was screwing up, 2949. I went and looked at that in Fulcro. And it turned out 2949, and these are misaligned because this is a different branch, was this line right here. And this line right here does a group by, and it was doing a conform, and so the group by was seeing a keyword in the output of conform, but conform shouldn't have been outputting a keyword. So I added a little debugging statement in here and used a snapshot version of Fulcro to see what was actually coming here. And what was happening was conform was returning invalid. It was literally returning the keyword, not a list, not anything else. Literally turning the keyword closure spec alpha / invalid because it wasn't conforming. And when I would print out what protocols had in it, that looked perfect. Like there was nothing wrong with it. I do the macro expands, it looks right. I mean, I did this for quite some time. So if I go and look at like in this guy, I thought I left it lying around. I guess I didn't. When I do the macro expand, it would look exactly like what I was supposed to have. Oh, and here's my output. So here's how I eventually found it, is I put this log message right in here so I could look at what protocols had in it. And I dumped out the data type of every element of protocols, this sequence. So the sequence looked right, but when I dumped out the types, it said, okay, well, you're getting static as a symbol, you're getting other as a symbol, you're getting this thing as a cons, and that right there was the problem. That's why my spec was failing, because when you're typing a defsc, there's no way to type anything there except a list, and it should be an error if you put anything else there but a list. But a cons is not a list. And so my spec here in this lower level macro, you could have never hit this error if you were using defsc, because there was no way to get it to pass the first layer. But because protocol method is defined as a list question mark, the spec doesn't conform. So I just get invalid. That crashes my macro. So this is the sort of thing that, to debug this, you have to realize, okay, I'm in the compiler, and when it gives me this stack trace, I guess when it gives me a stack trace like this, I have to look back and find, where there's code I'm running. In this case, I am outputting a defsc macro. that's crashing, and I have to figure out what's going to that line to make it crash. And oftentimes that does involve looking at things like what data type the individual element of syntax is you're sending, because if you're expecting one thing and getting another, well, it's just not going to work. So like I said, the fix was I added a test that said it emits method bodies as actual lists and went looking for it. Of course, that fails. And then I went over to extensions and I just applied list to the output of that. Now my tests pass, and then I can kill this and restart it to get rid of that macro caching issue, and it compiles. So that was the end result of all this. Again, feel free to check out the final source code of this macro on Fulcro Incubator on GitHub. Thanks.